Have you ever stopped and wondered, why despite all the effort, all the planning, all the hoping, life still feels heavy? Why is it that even when we chase with everything we've got, success, love, peace, it always seems just a little out of reach? You might think you're not doing enough, that maybe you haven't worked hard enough, that if you just push a little more, life will finally cooperate. But what if everything you're seeking is already on its way to you? And what if you're the one blocking it? Let that sink in. The very things you desire most, love, clarity, freedom, ease, aren't waiting on more hustle. They're waiting on you to stop resisting. See, there's a quiet truth the world has forgotten. A truth so simple, so ancient, it doesn't shout. It whispers. And if you slow down just long enough, you might hear it too. You only lose what you cling to. The Buddha. We live in a world obsessed with doing, hustling, fixing, winning. We chase happiness like it's some rare treasure at the end of a maze, and along the way we trade our peace for progress that never quite arrives. We micromanage our lives, our timelines, our emotions. We try to force outcomes. And yet the universe doesn't respond to force. It responds to energy, to presence, to trust, to alignment. Right now, in this very moment, something is unfolding behind the curtain of your everyday thoughts. Not chaos, not punishment, but a sacred test. A test of whether you will keep resisting or finally surrender. You're not being challenged by the universe. You're being challenged by your own grip, your need to control, to be certain, to figure it all out before it's time. So let me ask you a question, and answer it honestly. How much peace are you sacrificing just to hold on to a life that's not flowing anymore? And more importantly, what if the moment you let go, everything you deserve finally finds its way in? This isn't wishful thinking. It's ancient wisdom, and it's the heartbeat of this journey we're about to take together. You see, this video isn't going to give you 5 steps to manipulate the universe, or 7 hacks to calm your anxiety. Instead, it's going to offer you something far more valuable, a shift in perspective so deep, it can unravel years of overthinking, of clinging, of unnecessary struggle. What if peace doesn't come from doing more, but from doing less? What if the only thing between you and the life you want is your refusal to stop pushing? And what if letting go, not giving up, but truly letting go, is the most powerful act of trust you'll ever make? There's a rhythm to life, a quiet current underneath all the noise. And when you finally stop paddling against it, when you lean back, loosen your grip and allow, it begins to carry you. But you have to be still enough to feel it. You have to be brave enough to surrender. And I know, that word surrender, it scares people because we think it means weakness. We think it means giving up or not caring. But in truth, surrender is power, it's wisdom. It's finally realizing you don't have to chase what's already yours. So here's the invitation. For the next few chapters, I want you to do something most people never dare to do. I want you to pause, just breathe. Let yourself settle. Let the noise fade. Let your shoulders drop, your jaw soften, your mind slow. This isn't a performance. You're not here to be productive. You're here to receive. Because the wisdom that's coming next, it's not just meant to be heard, it's meant to be felt. And if you stay, truly stay, with your heart open, your mind quiet, you'll discover something that no external success could ever give you. You'll discover what happens when you stop trying to control life and start flowing with it. You'll understand why true calm isn't found in fixing everything outside, but in finding the stillness within. And more than anything, you'll remember what you forgot, that you are not here to struggle through life. You are here to align with it. So let go of the striving, the clenching, the waiting. Let go of the belief that you have to earn your worth, prove your value, or force every outcome. The universe already knows what belongs to you. It's just waiting for you to make space for it. And space is made not by doing more, but by learning how to let go. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Now imagine this. A sky releasing a storm. Thunder rolls away. Clouds drift apart, and everything returns to stillness, without resistance, without attachment. What would your life look like if you let go that easily? Let's go back to the sky. A moment ago, it was shaking with thunder. Clouds clashed. Rain fell like grief pouring from heaven. But now, stillness, silence. Blue skies stretch endlessly as if the chaos never happened. The sky doesn't hold on to storms. It doesn't replay the lightning. It doesn't relive the thunder. It releases completely. And here's the truth that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. You can't find peace while clinging to the storm. We've been taught that letting go is weakness. That real strength means holding tighter, fighting harder, pushing further. But in Buddhist teachings, true strength often comes not from control, but from surrender. Because the harder you grip, the more you suffer. We grip our jobs, our titles, our relationships. We grip who we think we're supposed to be. We grip old stories about our worth, our identity, our past. We call it ambition. But most of the time, it's fear dressed in a power suit. Fear that we'll fall behind. Fear that if we don't control everything, it will all fall apart. Fear that we're not enough unless we prove it over and over again. But look closely. Where has all that gripping really taken you? Has it brought peace or just exhaustion? Let me share a story, one that carries a lesson hidden in its silence. There was once a man who believed his happiness waited behind a grand wooden door. Every morning he woke up early and rushed to it. He pounded on it, he shouted, he begged it to open. Years passed. The door remained shut. The man grew bitter, tired, worn, but he never stopped demanding. Until one day, he collapsed from exhaustion and fell to the ground. And that's when he noticed, right behind him, all along, another door already open, sunlight pouring through. He had spent years trying to force open what was never meant for him, while ignoring the grace quietly waiting behind him. Control does that. It narrows our vision. It blinds us to the quiet blessings, the open doors, the opportunities arriving on their own timing. So ask yourself, what door have you been banging on for too long? What are you clinging to that keeps your hands too full to receive what's next? Maybe it's a job that once served you but no longer fits who you've become. Maybe it's a version of yourself that's outgrown its skin. Maybe it's a relationship that's now built more on habit than heart. And maybe, just maybe, what's waiting for you isn't behind more control, but behind release. Letting go doesn't mean you don't care. It means you're finally wise enough to trust. You see, when we try to force things, outcomes, people, timing, we're pushing against the natural flow of the universe. Imagine trying to hold back a river with your bare hands. You'll wear yourself out, and the river will still find its way. But if you stop fighting, if you allow it to carry you, you begin to flow with life instead of drowning in it. That's not weakness, that's mastery. The Buddha. This is not philosophy. This is physics of the spirit. What you hold onto too tightly begins to control you, and what you release sets you free. So what if letting go was the beginning of receiving? What if you don't need to chase what's already meant for you? What if peace isn't something you earn, but something you make space for? Let me give you a small but powerful metaphor. Picture a river. It doesn't force itself toward the ocean. It doesn't argue with rocks in its path. It doesn't worry about the shape of the land. It simply flows, naturally, effortlessly. And yet it always finds its way. That's the same rhythm waiting for you if you stop resisting it. Now I want you to take a breath with me. Inhale. And as you exhale, let something go, just one thing, a thought, a fear, a pressure, a should. Because every time you let go, you reclaim space. You make room for something better. You don't have to know every step ahead. You don't need a map. You only need to loosen your grip. You plant the seed. But you don't scream at the soil. You trust the sun. You trust the rain. You trust the timing. Letting go is not laziness. It's not indifference. It's alignment with truth. So here's the question I leave you with now, not to answer with words, but to hold quietly in your heart. What are you holding that's holding you back? Is it time to release it? Are you ready to become like the sky and let the storm pass? Because the peace you're looking for, it's already within you. It's just buried under control, fear, and expectation. And once you let go, the sky returns clear, open, free. Surrender. It's a word that makes many of us uneasy because we were raised to fight, to conquer, to push through. We were told that surrender means giving up, that it means being weak, passive, or helpless. But the truth is, surrender is not the end of power, it's the beginning of wisdom. You see, there's a deeper kind of surrender, not one born from defeat, but from understanding, not from fear, but from clarity, not from weakness, but from inner mastery. It's called mindful surrender, and it's one of the highest teachings of the Buddha. Imagine this. You're standing in a river. The current is strong, the water cold and urgent. You try to brace yourself, to resist, to hold your ground. But the more you fight the current, the more it drags you under. You panic, you tense, you sink. Now imagine something different. You let go, you float. You trust the water to carry you, not because it's safe, not because it's predictable, but because resistance was drowning you. That is mindful surrender. This isn't about doing nothing. It's about doing the right things from a place of calm. It's the art of letting life happen, without labeling it as good or bad, without trying to bend every outcome to your will, without fighting what is already unfolding. It's showing up fully while releasing your grip on the result. You act, but you're not attached. You try, but you're not desperate. You care, but you're not controlled by outcome. The Buddha taught that our suffering doesn't come from what happens to us. It comes from our resistance to what is. We fight the rain instead of learning to walk gently in it. We battle uncertainty instead of learning to rest inside it. We cling to control while the universe whispers, "Let go. You're not meant to carry this alone." There's a story of a young monk who asked his teacher, "Master, how can I find peace when the world is so uncertain?" The master smiled gently and handed him a cup of water. "Hold it still," he said. The student held it as best as he could, but his hand trembled. "Now place it down," the master whispered. And as the cup touched the earth, the water stilled. The monk looked up, eyes wide with realization. "Peace," the master said, "is not about holding everything perfectly. It's about putting it down." You see, surrender doesn't mean giving up your dreams. It means giving up your obsession with controlling how and when they arrive. It doesn't mean you stop showing up. It means you stop forcing what isn't flowing. Mindful surrender is a dance between effort and trust, between presence and patience, between taking action and releasing outcome. Let's go deeper. Mindful surrender is also the foundation of non-attachment. You may still love, still dream, still strive, but you no longer cling. And in that release, you become lighter. You no longer carry the weight of needing everything to go your way. You no longer need life to perform on your schedule. You begin to trust the timing of the universe more than your own timelines. And in that trust, something miraculous begins to happen. You stop chasing, and life begins to meet you halfway. Let me ask you, what are you currently gripping so tightly that it's making your whole body tense? What outcome are you trying to force? What fear are you trying to outrun? Now imagine what would happen if you stopped fighting it, if you breathed instead of bracing, if you sat in the unknown without trying to escape it. That's where real power begins, not in knowing, but in trusting without knowing. I want you to picture something. A candle. In the middle of a silent, still room, it doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to move. It just burns steady, calm, unwavering. That candle is your inner self when you surrender. When the storms of life rage outside, the candle within can remain lit if you stop letting the wind of resistance blow it out. Here is something you might not expect. The moment you stop trying to control life is often the moment it begins to work in your favor, because energy flows where attention goes. And when your attention is grounded in trust rather than tension, everything shifts. Surrender opens you. Resistance closes you. Surrender is spacious. Resistance is tight. Surrender breathes. Resistance chokes. Which one do you want to live in? Let me offer one final story. A young woman was at a breaking point. Her career was falling apart. Her relationship was unraveling. Her health was suffering. She had tried everything, pushed harder, planned more, held on tighter. Nothing changed. One evening, she walked into a meditation hall, tired, anxious, desperate for peace. She sat down, closed her eyes, took a breath, and for the first time, she didn't try to fix her life. She just let it be. She watched her thoughts pass like clouds. She watched her pain rise and fall like waves. She didn't resist. She didn't run. She simply sat still. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not the world, but her. You don't need to wait for your life to change to surrender. You don't need all the answers to find peace. You only need to be willing to sit with what is without trying to escape it. So today, take a step inward, be still, let go, and trust, because surrender isn't weakness. It's the deepest form of power. The kind that isn't loud but unshakable. The kind that doesn't control life but flows with it. And in that flow, you don't fall behind, you rise. When the mind is still, the soul can hear. And from this silence, a new clarity begins to emerge. Not from fixing every thought, but from watching them, calm, curious, and free. Picture a lake on a quiet night. The moon hangs above it, full and glowing. No wind, no ripples, just stillness, pure and vast. Look closely, and you'll see something remarkable. The lake reflects the moon with perfect clarity. No distortion, no noise, just truth. That lake is your mind when it is calm, but most of us, we don't live with a mind like a still lake. We live like a stormy ocean, waves crashing, thoughts swirling, emotions tossing us from one shore to another. And we wonder why we feel lost, why peace feels so far away, why happiness seems always just beyond our reach. It's not because peace isn't there. It's because we're too stirred up to see it. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within, do not seek it without." It's not just a quote, it's a doorway, because peace is not something we chase, it's something we remember. And the way to remember is to watch. To observe your thoughts without becoming them, to sit by the edge of your own mind like a still lake and just see. But how often do we truly do that? We don't watch our thoughts. We react to them, we believe them. We follow them down endless paths of worry, regret, fear, or fantasy. A thought appears, "I'm not enough." And we believe it. Another whispers, "What if I fail?" And we grip it like it's gospel. But what if you could just watch that thought? Let it rise and fall, without chasing it, without running from it, without drowning in it. This is the essence of mindful awareness. It's not about controlling your thoughts. It's about seeing them clearly, like clouds passing across the sky. You don't hold the cloud, you don't push it away. You simply watch. You don't argue with the weather, you let it pass. And in doing so, you begin to realize something miraculous. You are not your thoughts. You are the space they move through. There's a Zen saying, "You are not the clouds, you are the sky." Let that sink in. The sky never tries to control the weather. It simply allows. Likewise, your job is not to fix every thought. It's to become the sky again. To become the still lake that reflects the moon without distortion. Let me share a teaching story. A student once came to a Zen master and asked, "Master, my mind is restless. I can't meditate. I can't find peace. What should I do?" The master replied, "Sit by a lake, watch the water, wait." The student did as he was told. At first, the surface of the lake was choppy. Winds moved it. Insects landed. Ripples came and went. But the longer he sat doing nothing, simply watching, the lake began to settle. And in its stillness, it revealed the moon, the stars, and the sky itself. The student understood. When you stop stirring the mind, when you stop fighting every thought, truth reveals itself. So how do we practice this in daily life? It's simple, but it requires one thing most people avoid: silence. A few minutes a day. Sit. Close your eyes. Don't try to stop your thoughts. Don't try to think positive. Don't judge what arises. Just sit. Like a rock at the bottom of the lake, still, grounded, watching. A thought may come, "I'm falling behind." Let it drift. Another thought, "What will they think of me?" Let it float by. Another, "I should be doing more." Let it pass like a leaf on the water. Because the more you watch without clinging, the more power you take back. And eventually you'll see something incredible. You're not lost. You're just buried beneath noise. The more you practice this, the more you see patterns. You realize that many of your thoughts aren't even yours. They're echoes of your childhood, of society, of fear passed down from others. Not truth, just noise. And when you stop feeding the noise, silence grows, clarity rises, and peace, real, unshakable peace, begins to return. Think of it this way: a muddy river does clear when you stir it. It clears when you leave it alone. Your mind is the same. Let the mud settle. Let the chaos drift down. Let the stillness rise. Let me ask you, what thought have you been fighting today? What story is looping in your head? What if you didn't argue with it? What if you just watched? Let it come. Let it go. And in that space between thought and reaction, you'll find something sacred: freedom. Because when the mind becomes still, you begin to hear the deeper voice within. Not the voice of fear, not the voice of the world, but the quiet whisper of your own knowing. And from that knowing, clarity flows. So today, practice this. Sit, breathe, watch your thoughts like clouds, like ripples on a lake, like birds flying through a vast sky. And remember, you are not the waves, you are the depth. You are not the thoughts, you are the witness. You are not the storm, you are the still lake that reflects it all. When you return to the stillness within you, life outside begins to change too. But not because you forced it, because you finally saw clearly what was always there, beneath the noise. You can say all the right things. You can smile, act confident, set goals, work hard. But there's something more powerful than your words, more powerful than your actions, more powerful even than your thoughts. It's your energy. Because energy doesn't lie, and the universe doesn't respond to what you say. It responds to what you are. We've all met people who light up a room without speaking, and others who say all the right things, but something feels off. Why? Because the energy underneath speaks first. Always. Before your mouth opens, before your ideas land, before your plans unfold, your vibration has already spoken. In Buddhism, there's a simple but profound teaching. What you think, you become. What you feel, you attract. What you imagine, you create. And if your thoughts are racing, if your feelings are full of fear, if your imagination is ruled by doubt, then no matter how hard you try, you'll keep attracting more of what you're unconsciously carrying. Because life mirrors your inner state, so the question is no longer, what do I want to attract? The real question is, am I being the kind of person who naturally attracts that life? Let's be honest. We say we want peace, but are we vibrating with calm or with control? We say we want love, but are we radiating warmth or guarding ourselves in fear? We say we want abundance, but are we moving with trust or clinging to lack? You attract what you are, not what you pretend to be, not what you post online, not what you script in your journal. What you are beneath the surface is always calling life toward you. Let me tell you a story. There was a man who planted seeds every spring. He worked hard, tilled the soil, watered, waited, but year after year nothing grew. Frustrated, he blamed the weather, the sun, the timing, the world. One day, a quiet teacher passed by and asked, "Have you checked the ground of your mind?" The man blinked, confused. The teacher continued, "You plant with your hands, but you harvest from your vibration. If the ground beneath is poisoned by fear, nothing beautiful can take root. This is the secret most people never learn. You can do everything right on the outside, but if your energy is misaligned on the inside, you'll feel stuck. You'll wonder why things don't flow, why opportunities slip away, why relationships feel like mirrors of your worst doubts, because they are. Your energy is like a silent broadcast you're sending out every moment. It's the tone behind your voice, the pause between your words, the way your presence feels to others and even to life itself. So ask yourself now, what energy am I broadcasting into the world today? Is it grounded, or anxious, expansive, or afraid, trusting, or calculating? Because the world is responding to that, not your mask, not your hustle. And here's the beauty of this truth. You don't need to chase anything. When you become calm, opportunities seek you. When you become love, connection flows toward you. When you become peace, chaos loses interest. You stop chasing. Because what you are becomes magnetic. But that doesn't mean you sit back passively. It means your actions come from alignment, not desperation. There's a difference between acting from wholeness and acting to feel whole. When you act from wholeness, your energy is steady, clear, confident, gentle, and people feel it. So does the universe. Now let me give you a practical way to shift your energy right now. Sit quietly, place your hand over your heart, breathe in and ask, am I vibrating with the energy of what I wish to receive? Be honest. If the answer is no, good. Now you know, now you can adjust. Not by pretending, but by realigning. Choose gratitude instead of grumbling. Choose presence instead of projection. Choose faith instead of fear. These are small energetic shifts, but they carry massive spiritual weight, because every time you shift your energy, you shift your trajectory. The outside world may not change instantly, but your inner world just became magnetic. And that is where all lasting change begins. There's an old Zen saying, don't chase the butterfly, mend your garden and the butterfly will come. So stop chasing, start aligning, because the more you become what you seek, the more it seeks you back. Let me close with this truth. You don't attract from pressure, you attract from presence. And presence is the highest vibration there is. It says, I'm already enough. I trust the timing. I radiate what I want to receive. In that space, life rearranges itself around your frequency, and not because you forced it, but because you became it. So today, don't just want the life you dream of. Become the version of you who naturally lives that life. Live it in your thoughts, feel it in your energy, align with it in silence, and the rest will follow. You're trying so hard to get ahead, to be seen, to be certain, to prove yourself finally enough. You push, you plan, you overthink, and yet something feels off. Despite all your effort, life doesn't flow. Despite all your strategy, the results don't match the strain. And deep down, a quiet voice is whispering, there must be another way. There is, and it begins the moment you stop forcing and start surrendering to the rhythm of life. Not surrender in the sense of giving up, but surrender as in giving over to something wiser than your fear, bigger than your timeline, deeper than your ego, because life has its own rhythm. And when you align with it, things begin to unfold with surprising grace. Think of the ocean. It doesn't rush to create waves. It doesn't panic when the tide changes. It simply moves in rhythm. And somehow everything finds its place. The moon pulls, the waves rise, the shore receives. No resistance, just dance. Now imagine living your life like that, but here's the problem. We're taught the opposite. We're told to hustle harder, climb faster, control more, figure it all out now. And we believe that if we don't force it, we'll fall behind. But the truth? Forcing is what creates the resistance. Pressure is what creates the block. Control is what pushes your blessings away. Buddhism teaches, whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. Meaning everything in life moves in seasons. Joy, sorrow, growth, rest, success, delay, clarity, confusion, nothing stays forever. And the more you try to cling to the highs or escape the lows, the more you suffer. But when you surrender to life's rhythm, you begin to realize even the foggy paths have direction. Even the still moments are sacred. Even the delays are part of the unfolding. Let me share a story. A young warrior asked his Zen teacher, "When will I achieve what I seek? I meditate, I train, I strive, but nothing comes." The teacher looked at him gently and said, "Have you ever seen a flower bloom faster by yelling at it?" The warrior was silent. The teacher smiled. "Then why do you yell at your own growth?" This is the trap of modern life. We confuse urgency with alignment, but urgency is fear disguised as ambition. It says, "You're running out of time." It says, "You'll only be worthy when you arrive." Alignment says, "You're already becoming. You're already in rhythm." The flower doesn't bloom by willpower. It blooms when the sun is right, the soil is soft, and the season is ready. So why not trust that your time is coming too? Surrender isn't weakness, it's intelligence. It's the wisdom to know when to act and when to allow, because there is a greater timing at work. Call it karma, call it the Tao, call it life's quiet orchestration. But know this, you were never meant to control every step. You were meant to walk in harmony with what's unfolding. Here's how you begin. Instead of asking, "How can I make this happen?" ask, "How can I align with what's already trying to happen through me?" Feel the shift. That's surrender, that's rhythm. That's peace. The more you trust the unfolding, the more energy you reclaim. No more swimming against the current. No more arguing with life. No more fighting with time, just breath, just stillness, just listening. And then when it's time, action arises from clarity, not desperation. There's a Zen story of a man who sat by a river, waiting for his reflection to become still. But every time he tried to grab it, ripples appeared. Only when he sat quietly, patiently, did the surface clear. Only then could he see. This is how life works. When you force the moment, you disturb the clarity. When you trust the rhythm, it reveals itself. So let me ask you now, what part of your life are you trying too hard to control? What if you took one breath, one pause, and gave that part back to the rhythm? What if you stopped trying to build the wave and instead learned to ride it? Surrender is not inaction. It's inspired action. It's listening, it's aligning, it's flowing when the current calls, and resting when it doesn't, because just like music, the pauses are what make the notes beautiful. Just like breath, the exhale is just as sacred as the inhale. So too, your life has a rhythm. Honor it. Let today be the day you stop forcing. Let today be the day you trust your timing. Let today be the day you whisper to life, "I'm ready to dance. I'm done pushing. Show me the next step." And when that next step comes, take it with faith, not fear, with peace, not pressure, and suddenly, you'll realize you're no longer struggling upstream. You're floating, gliding, flowing. Because now, you're in rhythm with the universe. There comes a time when you realize that what's weighing you down is not the world outside, but the clutter within, not the noise of others, but the stories you keep repeating in your own mind. Not the chaos around you, but the confusion within you. We often think peace is about escaping, quitting the job, leaving the relationship, moving to the mountains. But true peace begins with this: removing what no longer belongs inside you, because your inner world is your sacred space. And when it's filled with old wounds, outdated beliefs, and heavy expectations, there's no room for clarity to land, no space for stillness to breathe, no opening for the universe to flow through. Think of it like a room. You want to meditate, reflect, rest, but it's packed with dusty boxes, tangled wires, broken furniture. You can sit in it. You can even try to light a candle, but the light gets lost in the mess. So what do? You start decluttering, piece by piece, not to be perfect, but to make space. And that is the same with your inner world. Ask yourself right now, what am I still holding on to? That's no longer serving my becoming, an identity you've outgrown, a relationship that drains you, a belief like, I have to prove myself, or if I rest, I fall behind. These are not facts. These are inherited patterns, emotional debris, and most of them are not even yours. There's a story from Zen Buddhism. A student asked his master, "How do I find clarity?" The master silently handed him a glass of muddy water. Then he simply sat. Minutes passed, no words. Eventually, the dirt settled to the bottom, and the water became clear. The master looked at him and said, "You don't find clarity by stirring. You find it by allowing the mud to settle." This is the art of inner decluttering, not solving every emotion, not analyzing every thought, but creating space inside so that what's real can rise to the surface. You don't need more information. You need less noise. You don't need another answer. You need fewer distractions from the answer that's already within you. So how do you begin? Start small. Start gently. Let go of the pressure to always respond. Silence the need to always be right. Pause before reaching for your phone. Spend one moment just watching your breath. Because every time you choose space over stimulation, stillness over scroll, awareness over autopilot, you are clearing the room. And in that room, truth can finally speak. Your mind is not the enemy. It's just messy, like any attic that's been left unattended too long. Open the windows, let the breeze in. Forgive what needs to be forgiven. Grieve what was never allowed to surface. Release what no longer aligns with who you are now. A powerful practice is to sit quietly and ask, what story am I still telling myself that creates heaviness in my chest? And then let it come up. No judgment, no fixing, just awareness. Because most suffering isn't from the thing itself, but from the way we keep carrying it. Like holding a rock for hours, then wondering why our arm hurts. Let it down, not because it wasn't real, but because it's not needed anymore. There's a woman who once spent years trying to fix everything: her finances, her relationship, her reputation. But no matter how much she fixed outside, she felt exhausted inside. One day in meditation, she whispered, "Why is nothing working?" A quiet voice within answered, "Because you still believe you're broken." That belief, unseen but powerful, was the clutter. It colored every action, every hope, every goal. And once she saw it, she could release it. And when she did, clarity rushed in like wind through an open window. This is the real work. Not chasing perfection, but clearing space. Space to breathe, to feel, to see yourself without distortion. Now hear this: you don't need to carry every past mistake. You don't need to repeat every old reaction. You don't need to hold on to everyone's expectations. Decluttering your inner world is an act of sacred rebellion, a return to simplicity, a return to you. Buddhism doesn't ask you to become something new. It asks you to remove what you are not. Remove the noise, The proving, the pretending, and what remains is peace, not because you earned it, but because it was always there, underneath the clutter. So take this moment to breathe into your own stillness. Ask yourself gently, what weight am I ready to put down? And then, do just that, not all at once, just one thought, one belief, one expectation. Let it go. Let it drift away like a leaf on a stream. You don't need it to survive anymore. In fact, letting it go is how you begin to truly live. The clearer your inner space becomes, the more effortlessly the universe flows through you. Ideas become intuitive, actions become aligned, life becomes lighter, not because it changed, but because you did. So declutter, not just your home, not just your inbox. Declutter your expectations, declutter your need to rush, declutter your fear of silence, and in that spacious stillness, truth will return, because the less you carry, the further you can go. There's a place inside you that no one else can enter, no voice can reach, no judgment can follow. It's not loud, it doesn't shout, it whispers when everything else goes quiet. That place is you, the real you. And you only find it in silence. But silence isn't comfortable, is it? We run from it. We fill it with music, noise, news, notifications. We scroll. We multitask. We consume. Because silence confronts us with what we've been avoiding. Ourselves. You see, the outer noise is often a distraction from the inner truth. And the world makes it easy to stay distracted. But the truth is, you can live your whole life chasing meaning and still feel empty because you never paused long enough to ask, what do I really feel right now? What's beneath all this noise I've been carrying? Silence is not absence, it's presence in its purest form. It's where the mind softens, the heart opens, the soul stretches its wings again after being caged by constant stimulation. In silence, you meet your shadow, but also your light. In silence, your illusions fall away, and your essence stands clear. There's a Zen story of a warrior who traveled far to ask a master, what is the truth? The master said nothing. The warrior grew restless. Minutes passed. Still, the master said nothing. Finally, in frustration, the warrior stood to leave. But the master raised a hand and said softly, truth cannot be spoken. It is felt in the silence between thoughts. That's the invitation of silence. It's not something you do. It's a space you enter, not to solve anything, but to see everything as it is. Because when you sit in stillness without a script, you begin to notice the subtle truths that hide beneath your busyness, that you're tired of performing, that you miss yourself, that your worth never depended on your output, and that maybe you've been looking for yourself in all the wrong places. Most of us have never truly met ourselves. We know our image, we know our resume, we know how others describe us. But when was the last time you sat with yourself? Without judgment, without expectation, without distraction, not to improve, not to analyze, but just to be. This is what silence offers you. Not answers from the world, but truth from within. In silence, you don't become less, you become whole. You start to hear the soft voice beneath the mental noise. The voice that says, I'm still here, I've always been here. You don't need to chase. You just need to return. Imagine your mind like a glass of water stirred with dirt, so murky you can't see through it. Silence is when you stop stirring, let everything settle. Then slowly, the water becomes clear, and you see yourself reflected in it. No distortion, no filters, just truth. But let's be honest, silence can be scary, because when the world goes quiet, the buried feelings rise. Grief you never processed, loneliness you've masked with busyness, dreams you gave up on but never stopped longing for. But don't run, breathe, because all of it is you, and none of it is here to harm you. It's here to be seen, so it can be set free. There's a kind of healing that happens when you sit in silence, without trying to fix anything. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, but it's real. It's a tear that falls without explanation. It's a smile that arises without reason. It's a sigh that says, finally, I can breathe. The Buddha taught, silence is an empty space. Space is the home of the awakened mind. It's not in having more thoughts that you wake up. It's in having fewer that you see clearly. You don't think your way into peace. You surrender your way there. Through stillness, presence, and silence. Start small. 5 minutes, sit. No phone, no music, no fixing, just sit. Let your thoughts come and go like clouds. Let your breath be your anchor. Let silence become your mirror. At first, it might feel uncomfortable, but over time, that discomfort becomes peace. That awkwardness becomes freedom. Because now, you're not escaping yourself. You're embracing yourself. And when you finally meet yourself in that silence, you realize you were never broken. You were just buried under expectations, under roles, under noise. But now, you rise, not as someone new, but as the you that was always there. Silence is not empty, it's full of you, the real you, the ancient, unshakable, undisturbed you. And when you return there, you don't need to prove anything anymore. You don't need to chase anything anymore, because you've remembered what the world wanted you to forget. That peace was never out there. It was inside you, waiting in the silence. So make time for it, not as a task, but as a gift. Because in silence, you don't lose yourself, you find yourself. What if I told you the universe has never once abandoned you? That even the detours, the delays, the heartbreaks were part of a much bigger pattern that only makes sense after the stillness? And what if your only job now is to live as if you already trust it? Not tomorrow, not after you have proof, but now. Trust isn't a theory, it's a posture. It's how you rise in the morning, it's how you speak when no one's watching, it's how you breathe when life goes quiet. And when you live as if you trust the universe, you stop begging for signs and start walking like one. You've probably been taught to believe that life responds to force, push harder, do more, control every outcome. But the deeper wisdom, life responds to frequency, to vibration, to alignment. You don't get what you chase, you get what you believe you're worthy of. And trust is the bridge between who you are and what's meant for you. Close your eyes for a second and ask yourself, what if today I lived as if everything was working out for me? Would your shoulders relax? Would your thoughts slow down? Would your breath deepen? You don't need certainty to do this. You need courage, the courage to stop clinging to control, the courage to replace what if it all goes wrong with what if it's all going right in ways I just can't see yet. There's a story of a small bird perched on a branch during a storm. The wind howled, the trees bent, the world shook, but the bird didn't panic. Why? Because it never trusted the branch. It trusted its wings. This is what trusting the universe looks like. You stop needing the world to be stable. Because you are. You stop waiting for the storm to pass. Because you've learned to soar through it. Now you might be thinking, but I've trusted before, and I still got hurt. Yes, because trust doesn't mean immunity from pain. It means you trust the pain itself is part of the path. That healing can come through what you didn't want, not just from what you did. Sometimes the delay is your protection. Sometimes the closed door is divine redirection. And sometimes, trusting the process means realizing you're being guided even when you feel lost. There's an energy that moves things without you needing to understand it. The river flows to the ocean without needing GPS. The seed breaks open underground without needing a strategy. The moon never rushes to be full, but always becomes so in time. What if you stopped trying to engineer your entire life and instead started to live in rhythm with it? Imagine this. You walk into every room with quiet confidence. You speak not to convince, but to connect. You create not out of fear, but from inspiration. You rest not because you're lazy, but because you trust the timing of your becoming. That's living with trust. That's alignment. You don't chase love because you know love is already woven into who you are. You don't force success because you believe what's meant for you cannot miss you. And when doubt arises, because it will, you meet it with compassion. You say, "It's okay. I don't need to know everything. I just need to take the next step in faith." Trust turns ordinary days into sacred ones, small steps into cosmic alignments, and silence into divine conversations. The universe isn't waiting for you to get it all perfect. It's waiting for you to believe you're already on the path. Even the shaky steps, even the moments of confusion, even the tears. Yes, especially the tears. Because when you keep moving forward, even while uncertain, you're not just hoping anymore, you're embodying faith. There's a phrase in Buddhism, leap and the net will appear. It doesn't mean you leap blindly. It means you live courageously. You stop waiting for perfect clarity and start honoring your deeper knowing. That knowing says, you don't need to earn your way into alignment. You are alignment when you're still, when you're true, when you trust. So here's the invitation. Don't just talk about trusting the universe. Live like it. Wake up each day and say, "Today I walk with trust. Today I allow joy without earning it. Today I release outcomes and embrace presence." Do this not as a performance, but as a way of being, because the universe doesn't respond to desperation. It responds to devotion. Devotion to truth, to stillness, to the unseen but deeply felt path under your feet. You are not here to micromanage your destiny. You're here to participate in its unfolding with grace, with awareness, with deep sacred trust. And when you live like that, you become magnetic. You don't chase, you don't force. You don't hustle your worth, you attract, you allow, you align. So take one breath now, feel your body, feel the life moving through you. And know, this moment right here is proof. You're held, you're seen, you're on the path now. Live like it. Let's pause for a moment. You've just walked through a journey that didn't ask you to add more, but to release, not to fix yourself, but to remember who you've been all along. You learned that letting go isn't weakness, it's the greatest strength. You discovered that the universe isn't impressed by effort alone. It responds to energy, intention, alignment. You've sat with silence, faced your thoughts, watched your mind like a still lake, let emotions rise and fall like waves, but stayed rooted like the mountain beneath them. And here you are, not changed, but returned. Returned to the calm you carried within you all along. There's something sacred in this remembering. It's the calm beneath the chaos, the clarity beneath confusion, the wholeness beneath all the chasing. And maybe, just maybe, this is what you were seeking all along. Not more answers, not louder motivation, but the quiet conviction that says, "I'm okay right now as I am." The calm within you isn't passive, it's powerful. It's not silence because you gave up, but because you finally let go of what was never yours to hold. It's the kind of calm that doesn't need to be explained. It can be felt in your breath, in your presence, in the way you start showing up for life without needing it to prove anything to you. Now here's your bonus wisdom, not a tip, not a trick, but a truth. You don't need to wait to become peaceful. You can choose to be peaceful now, even if your world is still messy. The lotus blooms in the mud, the candle glows in the dark, and your calm doesn't need perfect conditions to rise. It needs just one thing, your permission. The world will still swirl, deadlines will come, people will misunderstand you. Uncertainty will knock again at your door, but you don't have to answer in panic. You can answer in presence, in faith, in gentleness, in stillness. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within, do not seek it without." Now you know what that means. It's not just a quote. It's a lived truth. It means your calm isn't found in what happens. It's found in how you relate to what happens. The storm may still rage, but you've stopped being the storm. You've become the sky. So what now? Now you live with awareness, with openness, with trust. You walk not in fear of what might collapse, but in love with what's already unfolding. You speak with kindness. You breathe with intention. You act not to chase approval, but to honor your own alignment. And you remind yourself each day, I am already enough. I am already aligned. I am already whole. And if the path gets heavy again, which it sometimes will, return here. Return to this calm, to your breath, to the silence, to the truth you've always known deep down. You are not your fear. You are not your doubts. You are not your timeline. You are not your roles. You are presence. You are consciousness. You are that quiet, steady flame, unshaken by the wind. So let today be the start of something sacred. Not a new you, but a truer you, one that flows with life, one that trusts the timing, one that walks gently but powerfully in the world, because they've returned to the calm within. And if this message spoke to your soul, don't just keep it in your mind, live it. Be the calm in your family. Be the calm in your workplace. Be the calm your younger self never had. Be the calm the world so desperately needs. And if ever you forget, breathe, return, remember, because no matter what happens out there, there's always peace waiting in here.